Good morning. Welcome to Harmony. It is a beautiful day. A little chilly, but that's okay. It's my favorite time of year. The fall. I know things are starting to fade, but I don't know if there's too many places in this country that are prettier than the Hudson Valley in the fall. So, we're singing that song, For the Beauty of the Earth, and there's so many things for us to be grateful for and give thanks for and to express gratitude for, but this area really, it'd be fun maybe listening to that song and driving around the Eagle's Nest or Hawk's Nest or whatever they call it down towards Port Jervis, or just to kind of sit out here and watch the sky over the farm. It's beautiful. The heavens declare God's glory. God has revealed himself to us through his creation. It's such an awesome way to experience that. So I'm going to invite you this morning, if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Psalm 107. We're going to look at this idea of developing an attitude of gratitude this morning. Pastor Dennis, pray for him. He's recovering. Miss Kelly said he's feeling much better, so hopefully he'll be back this week and we'll be able to continue as scheduled. But this morning, it only seems right, since Thanksgiving is less than a week away, that we take a little bit of time to stop and pause and think about what that means from a standpoint of someone who's been redeemed, someone who's trusted Christ, someone who wants to be a disciple, but what gratitude looks like in our life. And I know I'm not the only one that probably has some wild Thanksgiving traditions. My dad would love this time of year, and we would always host. So we would have his 4 brothers and their families and my grandparents who lived right next door. And at any given Thanksgiving, there was probably 3, 4, maybe even 5 families outside of our family that would come and fill the house. There's only 40, sometimes 50 people. My dad, I probably get it from him, super extrovert, super relational. So that was just, he loved this time of year. I can remember like church tables we'd bring home and line them up like as much as we could through the house. But there was this very specific tradition that we did every year, and we do it in our house, is we would sit down to the table and everybody would sit and the food would be put on the table. And before we could eat, everybody had to share one thing that they were thankful for. Which, when you've got 40 to 50 people, you're watching as the turkey steam is starting to fade and the butter is starting to gel, and you're like, hey, can we please? And we didn't even pray yet for dinner, and it was so... I can remember as a kid at first, like, this is the coolest thing. I get to share something I'm thankful for. I'm thankful for my mom, and I'm thankful for this. But as I got older, it was like, all right, I'm thankful for my baseball glove. I'm thankful for football today. Let's eat. This is awesome. See, there's good that comes with that, but there's also bad that comes with that. Because I look in our lives for our family, we do something called High-Low Buffalo. And that says we sit around the table, share us something that was awesome today, share us a low point every day, and make something up, and we have to decide if it's true or not. And we go around the table, and Evangeline is always so excited. I want to go. It's like, it's not your turn. Okay, I want to go. It's not your turn. Take a break. Just relax. Chill. See, there's a difference there. There's a difference of what the action is and the attitude behind what gratitude is. So, because there's the action, like we understand the action of being grateful. Thank you. I appreciate it. I like this. This is beneficial to me. But there's this attitude that should come along with it. Because the difference between the two is one comes from a genuine place that's like in our emotions, and the other is just the behavior. We could just say, I'm thankful. This is great. I want to just check off that box and move on to the next thing so that my food doesn't get cold. I want to just check off that box because it's going to make my mom happy. Or I want to check off that box because it's what we're supposed to do. But I want to just kind of to challenge us to think this morning, what does it take to develop that attitude? We hear all throughout Scripture, and all things give thanks, pray without ceasing, loving, mercy, all of the characteristics of God that we're supposed to carry with us every day, and that are supposed to just like pour out of our lives. But that only comes if we have the right attitude behind it. Could you imagine what, forget just our country, but the world as a whole would look like if we celebrated Thanksgiving every day? if we celebrated Christmas every day, if we celebrated Valentine's Day every day, the love, the forgiveness, the compassion, the mercy, so many times it's so much easier for us to complain than it is to praise. And the cool thing about Thanksgiving and Christmas and the holiday season that we're going into is it doesn't matter where you fall on whatever spectrum you want to consider. When it comes to these holidays, we're all united together. We have dinner with Yankee fans. No, yeah, okay. Some people are, no, we don't. That's dangerous for being in New York. It doesn't care what our sports affiliation is, and really it doesn't matter, hopefully, where we fall politically, socially, culturally. Because what we're looking at is we're looking at something so much bigger than just an action of expressing thanks. So Psalm 107 is a really cool psalm, and it's written there a really cool time of Israel's history. But in this psalm, there are these three things that we're going to look at this morning that really help to understand what does it look like to develop this attitude. And we call the attitude of gratitude. I don't know, Rachel, you're here, you might remember. I think it was just like a hashtag thing we said at youth group once. Like back when Connor and you guys, they were probably like either juniors or sophomores. And it just became like, hey, attitude of gratitude, attitude of gratitude. And it was like this thing that we just kept saying. That doesn't sound like an attitude of gratitude. Right? So like it became like just this kind of like catchphrase of a reminder, attitude of gratitude, and what that looks like. So we're going to read some of these verses together, and we're going to spend some time looking at them this morning. But the first kind of stepping point in your notes talks about knowing where we came from. Knowing where we came from. Gratitude can often come when we remember where we came, when we remember what we were before Christ even, or what we've experienced in life, how we've moved from one phase to the next, how God has always continually been faithful. Because here's the first building block of this. It is a physical reality that you have been somewhere. Think about when you first got married. Think about when you first graduated from college. Think about your first child or whatever, or think about wherever it's been, the first apartment that you lived in. I get reminded of this all the time. I have ADD, really bad. So one of the cool things about ADD is you procrastinate all the time. And then you rent a one-bedroom apartment that's really a garage when you first get married, and you're like, this is amazing. When you're like, ooh. It was awesome, but it's the reality of where we were, where God has brought us. Let's look at some of these verses together. They're going to be out of order. Some are going to be paraphrased. Some are just going to be pulled out of the important stuff. But this is what the psalmist writes. He says, they wandered in the wilderness in a desert region. They did not find a way to an inhabited city. They were hungry and thirsty. Their souls felt weak within them. That's verses 4 and 5. And then as you fast forward, the cool thing about Hebrew poetry is it kind of gives us the opportunity. We can pull things out of it and go back and look at it because there's a bunch of themes that run through it. And we're going to look at some of those in a minute. But then it continues. It says, there were those who lived in darkness, in the shadow of death. Prisoners in misery and chains because they had rebelled against the words of God and rejected the plan of the Most High. Therefore he humbled their heart with labor. They stumbled, and there was no one to help. We don't have to really dig deep into what the psalmist writes here to understand what he's writing about. This is history. This is Israel's history. They wandered in the desert. They spent time in bondage. Think of all the times, if you read through the book of Judges, all the times that Israel goes through these moments of plenty and prosperity, and then all of a sudden they lose their focus. There's a shift in their attitude. There's a shift in their behavior. They fall into idolatry, and then what happens? They're slaves. And it seems like nobody's going to save them. And as you read through, you hear, someone help us, someone save us, and God faithfully raises someone up. It's the same thing in our lives. These are not unfamiliar elements to us. wandering in the desert, being in bondage? How many of you have experienced seasons of uncertainty in your life? Lack of movement. Feelings like we're alone. Seasons of feeling at odds with God because of the behaviors that we've done. But we don't recognize it as something we've done. We just look at it and go, hey, God, how come you're not answering me? What's going on here? But because of our attitude, because of our rebellion, that's what the psalmist is reminding us of. There is a physical reality to where you are today, to where you came from. There's also a spiritual reality. This is what the psalmist writes in verses 17 through 18. He says, fools, because of their rebellious way and because of their guilty deeds, were afflicted. Their souls loathed all kinds of food, and they came close to the gates of death. Verse 26 and 27, it says, they rose up. But we have to know what rose up there. There's a lot of verses to share before it, but basically the psalmist uses this imagery about being on the sea and how people did business on the sea. So there was a familiarity of being on the sea and being in these boats and being out to shore to business, to do whatever. But then he talks about the uncertainty of the waves. And this is what he talks about. They rose up, the waves. So at some point in this imagery, it says they rose up. The waves rose up from the sea to the heavens and went down to the depths. Their souls melted away in their misery. They reeled and staggered like a drunken person who were at their wits' end. A lot of times when we read through some of the things like this about our souls feeling afflicted, about our hungering, being on the point of death, this whole idea of souls melted away in misery. It's a reflection of the spiritual turmoil that we feel in our lives. So there's a very physical reality, things that we can touch that are tangible in ways that only we understand about recognizing and knowing where we came from. But there's a very real spiritual element to this as well. Feeling separated from God, or maybe being separated from God because you haven't stepped into that relationship with Him yet. And at some point, the cool thing about looking at Israel's example is these were God's chosen people. These are people that had a relationship with God. They knew God. They experienced God's provision. They've experienced His protection. They've experienced His blessing. And yet they still found themselves in seasons of turmoil. Spiritually separated from God, physically separated from God. But there's a constant that maintains all throughout. So knowing where we have been, both physically and spiritually, should cause us to have an appreciation for where we are now. Recognizing where you've been, where you are, but more importantly, who else is involved. And this is the really cool part about this psalm. Because we look at the verses that we kind of skipped over and we see as this big poem is written and these beautiful words come into be, it's about this. It's about knowing who hears and who helps. Where do we turn when we're in physical turmoil? Do you have the self-awareness to recognize when things start getting topsy-turvy that God's trying to get your attention? There's 2 or 3 things in my life that I look at and I go, okay, this is, from experience, this is God trying to get my attention. From a spiritual standpoint, do we have the self-awareness to realize, hey, there's something broken in this relationship. There's some turmoil here. There's despair here. There's distress here. Who or what are we turning to? Because the reality is there's a lot of things that we could turn to. A lot. But none of those things compare to the God that is waiting to help us. To the God that is waiting to hear. One of the cool features of Hebrew poetry is this idea of repetition. It just repeats themes over and over again. Sometimes it repeats them in different ways. You're like a strong fortress. You're like a mighty gate. Like, okay, well, that's like the same thing. Yep, it is. And in here, this psalm is no different. There are a number of verses, 4 of them, in this psalm alone that talks about God hearing our desperation. So it's knowing who hears and helps. Who is it? It's God. It's God who hears and helps. In verses 6, 13, 19, and 28, it all says the same thing. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. He saved them from their distress. They're wandering in the wilderness. They're bondage. They're prisoners. They're feeling this inner turmoil. They're in a physically bad place. They're in a spiritually bad place. All 4 of these things. And it's the same exact verse. They cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. That's a lot easier than I made it sound. Here's the cool thing about these verses. It doesn't matter what the desperation is. It doesn't matter if it's physical. It doesn't matter if it's spiritual. What the psalmist is driving home in these patterns of repetition is this: God is faithful. He hears and he saves. Not only does he hear and he helps, there's specific ways that he helps. How does God respond when we cry out to him? Well, just in these verses, here's the different ways that he helps. It says that he had them walk on a straight way to go to an inhabited city. He provides direction. He guides. He leads. He has a destination in mind. It says he brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death. He's the light. Again, that talks about protection. It talks about being restored. It talks about being rebuilt. He sent his word and healed them and saved them from their destruction. They're headed in a bad place. There's guidance here. There's salvation. There's something that continually works. He caused the storm to be still. And it's awesome that verse popped up this morning. We didn't talk about that. But Jesus calming the storm, saying, "Peace, be still." Everything goes calm. And all the disciples can go, who is this guy? He calms the storms to be still, so the waves of the sea were hushed. He guides to safe harbor. God hears and God helps. There are so many, I stopped counting at maybe 9 or 10 different parts of the Psalms where David is writing and he's just pouring out his heart. And the book of Psalms is a roller coaster of emotion and despair and joy and suffering and sorrow and happiness and gladness. And so many times when David's writing, David says things like, "God, bend down to me and listen. God, turn your ear towards me. God, hear what I'm saying to you." It's like this continual opportunity. This is the God who hears. This is the God who turns his attention to us. We're not just floating out into the matter of the universe existing, trying to figure out what comes next. There's a real God who is active, who does things, who wants to intervene on our behalf. And that is something that we can give thanks for and be grateful for because he knows where we were. He knows how to bring us into that relationship with him. He's caused spiritual healing. He hears, he listens, he desires to interact, but sometimes our attitude is what stops us from truly experiencing the greatness of God in all that he does. Where have you been? Where are you now? Who hears? Who acts? And this is kind of where we get to start to wrap up. We're almost done. I mean it, really. It's about knowing God. It's about knowing where we were. It's about knowing where we are going, looking back, looking forward. It's about truly recognizing and embracing who hears us, who helps us, but it's also about knowing God's character. The psalmist makes it very clear throughout the Psalms. This is some of the things that he says about God. He's good. That's verse 1. 5 times the psalmist talks about how God is merciful. He talks about how he satisfies. He keys in on his power, his works that set him apart from everything else. There's nothing like God. In all that he does, this is just a snapshot of who God is, of what God does for us, of what he provides. It just says, look, here's some simple things. He's good. He's merciful. He satisfies. He's powerful. The works that he does, there's nobody else that can do these things. He just completely is set apart from everything else. Why is that important? Because when we know God's character, we can trust God. If he's honest and he only does good, we know that we can trust what he says. If he's all powerful, that means he can take care of whatever I have. If he doesn't change, I don't have to worry about waking up one morning and going, God totally just flipped the script. He doesn't change. He's eternal. Knowing God's character. God is a God of mercy, a God of deliverance, a God of healing. He satisfies all that we desire, and he's set apart. It's one thing to know God's character. In reality, that should not be enough for us. I love how the psalmist closes out Psalm 107. This is what he says in verse 43. He says, who is wise? He is to pay attention to these things and consider the mercy of the Lord. Who's wise? It's not just about knowing. It's about taking that knowledge and putting it into action and actually applying it and understanding. God is compassionate. He's merciful. He's powerful. All the things that we just talked about in his character. The psalmist says, consider these things. Because there's a personal element that is the most important foundational building block of developing this attitude of gratitude, of having built this practice of continual thanksgiving in our lives, and it's knowing God personally. He's a personal God. He's a relational God. Look all the way back into the beginning of creation. God is, and he does. In the beginning, God created, and he creates humanity. And he looks at him and says, this is really good. And they're in relationship with each other because God has created us in his own image. He's given us the ability to create. Not like he does, but we can create things. We can sustain life to some level. We have the ability to love and to show compassion. We have the ability to interact with God. That's the whole point of what we're here for, to glorify, to honor God, to live for him, to experience this genuine, real, tangible relationship in the physical, in the spiritual, in despair, in distress. It's knowing God's character and taking it a step further and truly understanding, knowing him. The whole point of today's text is an attitude of gratitude comes from knowing God personally. And once that starts, we see where he's brought us, both in our physical life and in our spiritual lives. It's knowing that he hears and acts on our behalf. Why? Because he's personal. It's knowing that we know God in real, tangible ways. And the reality is we're just going to be a passive observer until we move into that point where we're living in right relationship with God. So we know all about him. We've heard the stories from Sunday school, but they don't penetrate the heart. They stay here. We know that we could trust him, but we don't. We know that he satisfies, but we turn to something else. We know that when we're struggling and when we're in despair, we could call out to him, but we'd rather complain and argue or fight with somebody else. We'd rather try to come up with our own way to overcome a situation because I can handle this. This is what I'm supposed to do. And God's like, well, don't do it by yourself. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up because we're getting ready to close. And as they're coming up, I just think about just these three things in our life. Think about it on a personal level, not just as like the church as a whole. Obviously, when we talk about attitudes of gratitudes and showing thanks and giving thanks, there's the elements that we do as a body, but on an individual level, stop to pause and consider, hey, what has God really delivered me from? Where has God brought me? Where has God provided for my needs? Where are those situations and instances where maybe I gave credit to something or somebody else? That's okay. Verse 1 of this psalm, the psalmist starts out and he's like, hey, let the redeemed of the Lord give thanks. Listen, that's a real fancy way to say everybody who has been set free by God, give thanks. Tell your story. Tell it to the nations. Gather. Let this be our songs of praise. Give thanksgiving for what God has done. And that's really, hopefully, what we get a chance to do, not just on Thursday, but every day. Imagine if every day we found something new to be grateful for. We found something new to experience in God's character. That we were intentional about that relationship, just as intentional in that relationship with God as we're intentional with our spouse, or with our best friends, or with however. Think about what that would look like, where God would continually, where could you go if you just gave it over? We're going to sing. And as we sing, you can think about it, you can meditate, there's space for prayer, but just to stop and to think, what kind of attitude do I have right now? Is it an attitude of this Thanksgiving, gratitude, giving thanks? Or is it something else? What's broken? What's stopping me from living in that? What's stopping me from fully embracing what God has for me? Let's sing.
Your presence in me, Jesus, light the way. By the power of your word, I am restored, I am redeemed. By your Spirit I am free, and I will fall at your feet. I will fall at your feet, and I will worship you here.
Before we finish our song this morning, there's a chance that there's some of us that are thinking, what does this matter? Maybe in this season that you're in, you're outside of that category of redeemed. You've not been set free. You've not experienced the reality of Jesus in your life. You've not experienced what it means to totally live in freedom and embrace these things. You know about the character of God. You've asked questions about the character of God. You've studied the character of God, but you've not yet stepped into that real, true, genuine relationship with. And I'm telling you this morning, I'm sharing Ephesians chapter 2. It says, "And you were dead in your offenses and sins, in which you previously walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience." And it says, "Among them too all previously lived in the lusts of their flesh, indulging their desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the rest." Listen, everybody in this room has been in this category, or maybe you're in this room and you're in this category. Children of wrath, set to be mindful of what culture in the world tells me I need instead of what God has provided. Telling me and convincing me that it's just enough to know about God is, but I'm telling you this morning, this is what's awesome. Among them too, all of us, we lived according to the lusts of our flesh, what we wanted, indulging in those desires, children of wrath, but God. This is one of my favorite parts in all of Scripture because it says, "But God, being rich in mercy because of His great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our wrongdoings, made us alive together with Christ." And here's the best part. Because of that, because of God's grace, there is salvation. There is freedom. There is victory. Listen, there is a reality to being in relationship with a God who hears and who helps. And it's not just His character that we should focus on. It's that real relationship. This morning, this is our God. This is what we're singing about. This is our answer to despair. This is our answer to what's not fulfilling our lives, what satisfies us the most. The psalmist said, "Consider the mercy of the Lord." We're going to sing, we're going to finish the song, but I want to tell you this morning, there's an opportunity. We have people all throughout this room that would love nothing more than to pray with you, to talk to you about what it means to walk in right relationship with God, to start off on that journey. And listen, maybe you're here this morning and you've just been stuck in despair and distress, and you're like, "I've got nothing left. I'm crushed. I don't even know where to turn." We'd love to pray and talk with you as well. You don't have to come forward. You can sneak off to the side. There's people in the back. There's people that are already tuned in to say, "Hey, who can I pray with?" Guess what? We don't have to do this alone. This morning, whatever you need, God can satisfy. Consider His mercy. Let's finish singing this morning. If you need prayer, come up, go to the back, sneak out to the side. If you'd like to know more about what it means to be in right relationship with God, to go into that saving relationship, to know Him personally, we'd love to talk to you this morning.
Surrender your life upon that cross. Great is the love poured out for all. This is our God, lifted on high from death to life. Forever our God is glorified, servant and King, rescue the world. This is our God.
Sing that again. Freely you gave.
Freely you gave it all for us. Surrender your life upon that cross. for all. This is our God, lifted on high from death to life. Forever our God is glorified. Servant and King, rescue the world. This is our God.
This is our God. He's a chain breaker, a way maker, a miracle worker, and a promise keeper. The light in the darkness. The one who freely gave it all. Surrendered everything he had to be our rescuer. Let us go forth and have our attitude reflect his actions. Lord, be with us as we go out this week. Watch over us. Those of us that are lost, and when our despair is too much and it's eating us away, be that light. Be that rescuer that we need. Come and be our God, because that is who you are. Amen.